So Diocletian is marked as the end of the 3rd century, and he starts the 4th century. And we move right into a Persian War from 96 to 98 to end the 3rd century. And the Romans will get 1 win and 1 loss in this, because war breaks out again when Narses declares war on Rome and he invades Armenia, which was a Roman protectorate. Then he invaded Roman Mesopotamia. Diocletian sent his son-in-law Galerius to the east. The legions encountered Persians under Narses at Carrhae. History repeated itself as the legions suffered a severe defeat here, so this is their loss. Now Galerius received reinforcements, however, during winter, and the following year he pursued the Persian host to Armenia. Once again, the terrain favored the Romans and not the Persian cavalry. Catching Narses by a surprise night attack, the Romans routed the enemy in 2 successive battles. Then he invaded Media and captured Nisibis, then moved down the Tigris and took Ctesiphon. The Persian army was decimated and peace was made, and Rome regained Mesopotamia up to the Tigris River and was allowed to continue hegemony over Armenia. So we give the Romans a victory for that. And in the last video, I went over the Persian problems and the Romans' problems about trying to control the territory out there and how difficult it was. And then Diocletian had his 4-fold system. Remember, there was 2 Augustus, which were the main leaders. One was in the west, one was in the east. The east was Diocletian, in the west was Maximian. And then under them were 2 Caesars that helped control their areas. In the west, under Maximian, was Constantius, and in the east, under Diocletian, was Galerius. Now, in the west, Maximian had his problems with the Germans, and most notably by Carausius. He was a rebellious admiral in the Roman fleet, who 13 years after Postumus' rule in Gaul ended, he took over and called himself Emperor of the North. Now, the 2 Augusti endured Carausius as a colleague in Britain and northern Gaul. Eventually, Maximian's Caesar, which was Constantius, drove him from Boulogne, and when Carausius was murdered, Constantius continued the war against his murderers and successor. Now, Constantius doesn't get any victories here because when Carausius was murdered, his murderer Electus was then murdered, so it was easy for Constantius to mop up Britain and northern Gaul. But he did have 2 major battles against the Lamani in Gaul, and he got 2 victories for that. So Diocletian's 4 tetrarch system worked very well. Galerius was 2-1, and Constantius was 2-0. In Diocletian's tetrarchy, Constantius became the Augusti in 305 when Maximian died. So when he becomes Augusti, he is now to appoint a Caesar to help him rule. But a year later, Constantius died in York, and in 306, the legions there proclaimed Constantius' son, Constantine, as Augusti. Now, in Diocletian's 4-fold system, the Caesar should have moved up to become Augusti, but Constantius never named one. So the 4-fold system of Diocletian was in fact among the less durable of his institutions, and its obvious vulnerability to the old maladies saddened him before his death. And then Diocletian's reign was one of the last and most severe persecution of the Christians. All 4 of the emperors issued a series of edicts rescinding Christians' legal rights, demanding that they comply with traditional religious practices. And this brings us to our 8th Roman Civil War. Now I know there was a lot of fighting in the crisis of the 3rd century, but I list the First Civil War as Sulla versus Marius, the Second Civil War as the Populars Party versus the Optimist Party. That was the fallout of the First Civil War. The Third Civil War is Caesar versus Pompey. The Fourth Civil War was the Caesarian faction versus the Senatorial faction. which culminated in Octavian versus Antony. The Fifth Civil War was the year of the four emperors. The Sixth Civil War was Septimius Severus. The Seventh Civil War was the crisis of the 3rd century, because remember, from 235 up to 284, we just call it 285, but in that time was just one big civil war. It was a major crisis going on there, and the armies were constantly fighting each other. So I just label that as the Seventh Civil War to make it easy. And then the rise of Constantine is the 8th Civil War. Now Constantine takes over after his father dies in 306. Now the true Augusti, remember Constantine's legions in the north proclaims him Augusti, but the true Augusti was Maximian's son, Maxentius. And so Constantine takes his armies and he crosses the Alps with 50,000 men. Maxentius sent an army north to block this advance, but Constantine pushed past the resistance at Turin and marched down the Po Valley. He laid siege at Verona, defended by Pomponius, a lieutenant of Maxentius. Pomponius escaped and organized a relief force. Constantine wheeled about and crushed these forces, and Pomponius was killed. Verona promptly surrendered. Constantine now headed to Rome. So this is Constantine's first victory. Now, as he heads to Rome, it brings us to the Battle of Saxa Rubra, or Melvin Bridge in 212. Now, leaving the protection of Rome's walls, Maxentius advanced to meet Constantine 9 miles north. And Constantine reported on October 28, in 312, to have seen a flaming cross in the sky and the words, "By this sign thou shalt conquer." The two armies collided, and Constantine's horse scattered the enemy horse on both wings. His combined attack then shattered Maxentius' unprotected infantry. The manifestation that Constantine had before the battle led Constantine to become Rome's first Christian emperor, even if it's still hearsay or haven't been proven, and even upon his deathbed when he allegedly converted. Now, the following year, he turned his attention toward the eastern part of the empire now that he had settled the west and was in complete charge of the west. Now, first he confirmed his alliance with Licinius through the Edict of Milan, and Licinius was the Caesar of the east, but the Augusti of the east, Valerius Maximinus, he promptly invaded the Balkans. With 70,000 men, he seized Byzantium and moved on to Heraclea, where Licinian 30,000 Illyrians were. Valerius attacked, and initially, because of the superiority of forces, gained an advantage, but the skill of Licinius and the disciplined Illyrian legions eventually won the upper hand. Maximinus fled to Syria and died the next year. Constantine and Licinius divided the empire between them. Now, this battle isn't a Constantine victory, or do any of these battles go on the Roman battle record, because it's a Roman civil war, Roman versus Roman. But now there was just two men in charge of the empire. And you can only guess what's going to happen here between these two guys. But before I get into that, I just want to say that Constantine developed the Roman army along the lines which Diocletian had laid down and which had been apparent in Aurelian's time. Static frontier forces occupied the forts in peripheral zones or manned the lines of river barriers. Now remember, these men would settle in with the communities, have families. They pretty much stayed there. They were just a defense for that area. The best troops, however, were reserved as a mobile striking force which could direct its energies as emergencies arose. The infantry units of the striking force were still deemed legions, though their strength was reduced to about a third of the old Marian legions. Now, because of the mobile force's greater need for a cavalry element, the barbarian forces living on the frontier usually supplied the cavalry element with men, but as the forces were needed to go elsewhere, these men could not be relied upon to live up to their commitment, and they would not upheld them. So Constantine had to use the best men from legions to be used in the cavalry, which led to undersizing of the legion strength. And he also abolished the Praetorian Guard. That brings us to two battles, Cibalae and Mardonius in 314. The showdown between the two rivals took place 8 years after the defeat of Maximinus. Constantine took 20,000 men into the Pannonia area, where he encountered 35,000 Illyrians under Licinius. The two armies clashed, and Constantine pushed back the Illyrians, but they counterattacked, and Constantine's forces took heavy losses, but did break the enemy line, and Licinius retreated toward Thrace. So Cibalae is a victory for Constantine. Now, they met again at Mardonius, and Constantine dealt Licinius a second defeat. He retreated into the mountains of Macedonia. Constantine realized he would need a decisive battle to end this, but this could take a while and drag on into a long, bloody civil war. So he negotiated a truce and redivided the empire, which brought 9 more years of peace. Which brings us to 323, the Battle of Adrianople, the first one. 9 years went by, and war broke out between the two emperors again. One contested point was Christianity, which Licinius persecuted. The other was whose responsibility it was to repel invaders in the Balkan area. Constantine marched into Thrace with 50,000 men and met Licinius, who had a similar sized force. Constantine skillfully maneuvered the eastern army out of its entrenched positions. In the open, his disciplined legionaries overpowered Licinius' inexperienced troops. More than 20,000 died in a fierce battle that found Licinius retreat into Byzantium. And between 323 and 324, we have the Battle of Byzantium. Constantine pursued Licinius to Byzantium. Licinius deployed his army to resist Constantine's siege. Licinius then crossed the Bosporus to raise an army to relieve the siege. Constantine ordered his fleet of 200 warships into the Dardanelles, where Licinius' fleet of 300 ships were protecting Byzantium by sea. Constantine's fleet routed Licinius with the loss of 150 ships, and Constantine was free to send his army across the Bosporus. Now, this brings us to the Battle of Chrysopolis in 324. And the religious aspect of the conflict was reflected in Licinius drawing up his battle lines with images of pagan gods of Rome prominently displayed, while Constantine's army fought under his Christian standard of the Labarum, which is basically a Christogram, which is formed with a PX, the first 2 Greek letters in Christ. And Constantine supposedly did not use any maneuvering. He realized that Licinius's army were inexperienced, and he ordered an all-out massive assault. And in this assault, his regulars killed almost 20,000 out of 50,000 men opposing them. Licinius was captured and the following year executed. Constantine, he won a decisive battle and returned to Byzantium, and the city surrendered. The Roman Empire was under one ruler, Constantine, now known as the Great. It was 6 years later he renamed the rebuilt city of Byzantium to Constantinople. Now, Constantine is perhaps best known for rebuilding Byzantium and calling it Constantinople. And I've already stated that he became a Christian, or at the very least gave support to them. And he adopted the military standard of Christ's name in Greek, the XP. And he painted the device on his soldiers, and they first carried it into battle in 312. Now, the other thing that he is known for is calling the Council of Nicaea in 325. Now, because the empire was strife with religious contention between Christians who believed that Jesus Christ was God, and then Arianism that believed that Christ had the God spirit in him and God was moving in him, but he wasn't really God. And for Constantine wanted to bring the empire together and have unity, he wanted to settle this big problem. That's how big of a problem it was. Now, most people are confused here. They think the Council of Nicaea was to pick what books were going to be in the Bible, and that is absolutely false. They weren't there to do no such thing. They already knew that the Oriental canon, which was established in Greek, they have it dated back to about 170 to 180 AD. They already had 22 of the 27 New Testament books already established in that. They weren't there to pick the books of the Bible. They were there to establish that the books they were using, since they were written in the first century, were truly inspired by God. And Constantine, who presided over the council, wanted to settle the question once and for all. Jesus Christ was truly God himself, which is basically the question that has stood since he died and will stand until we die. That is the argument. Now, Constantine's last campaign was on the lower Danube, where he recovered briefly some of Dacia. He was planning a war with Persia when he died. His son, Constantius II, took over in 337. He was not a gifted military man, which led to long conflicts with the Sasanian Persian king Shapur II. The fighting was often bloody and dragged on for more than 20 years. This Persian war went from 338 to 363. Constantine was 8-0 in major open field battles, which are all against Roman armies. So back to Constantius II, Constantine's son, taking over. So Constantius met Shapur at Singora. Now, this is a loss for the Romans. The Romans put the Persians to flight and pursued them into the hills until night. The weary victors bivouacked, and the main Persian army fell on them at night and inflicted a terrible slaughter. The Persians failed to follow up on the victory and could not take the city of Nisibis on the Syrian frontier. Shapur laid siege to the city for 3 months and lost about 20,000 men. Now, Constantius single-mindedly campaigned against Persia, even though there was civil unrest in the European theater. Constantius's two brothers, Constans and Constantius III, they ruled together in the west, and when they quarreled, Constans killed his brother in 340. Constans was then slain in 350 by Flavius Magnentius, who usurped the western throne. Then Constantius II abandoned the Persian War and went west to deal with this hostile ruler. Now, this starts our 9th Roman Civil War in the 5th century. Now, this is the Battle of Mursa in 351. Constantius marched into the Balkans, and at Mursa, his 40,000 men encountered 50,000 men of Magnentius. They clashed in a bitter struggle that resulted in a victory for Constantius, although he lost 15,000 men to 12,000 men. Despite this, Magnentius had to fall back. Constantius pursued him. Finally, in 353, deserted by his remaining forces, Magnentius committed suicide. The empire was united once again. Now, this brings us to the Caesar Julian. Now, his upbringing was very interesting, and his father was killed and his half-brother killed by Constantius, and he was allowed to be educated. He was educated in the East, in Athens, and he was kind of kept under lock and key for a while. But anyways, in 355, he was elevated to the rank of Caesar, and he was married to Constantius' sister. Now, he was ordered to take to the Rhine to repel invasions by the Franks and the Alemanni. Now, though completely inexperienced in military matters, he successfully recovered Colonia Agrippina in 356, and in 357 defeated a vastly superior force of Alemanni near Argentoriet or Strasbourg. I know I butchered that name, but this is the battle in 357. Now, as Julian was moving over a hill toward the Germans, he had suspected an ambush from the woods, and he halted and he deployed skirmishes. And the German cavalry, it is interesting, we're not completely sure why, but they dismounted and they attacked on foot. Now, most historians believe that was because they wanted to embolden the German infantry that was supposed to spring this ambush, that they were not going to run and leave the battle, to make sure that they would stay and fight. So they dismounted. Now they caused the Roman cavalry on the right side to panic and flee, and the Roman cavalry commander was killed in the retreat. Now the Batavi and the Regi, the Roman auxiliaries, they rushed to fill this gap. The Roman left holds. Now, the Roman cavalry retreat runs into the Roman legionaries, and Julian rallies them back into the fight. As the Roman left pushes forward, the Germans, led by a band of nobles, break through the center, but they are halted by the legion of the Promani and pushed back. The Romans continue to push back the whole line, and the Germans break. Julian routed the barbarian force, inflicting 6,000 casualties. And Condomar, the Alemanni chief, was taken prisoner. Now, following this, Julian crossed the Rhine and raided German strongholds and gained yet further victories over the Germans in 358 and 359. The troops quickly took to Julian, a leader who, like Trajan, endured the hardships of military life alongside the soldiers. But also the general population of Gaul appreciated their new Caesar for the extensive tax cuts he introduced. Now, you would think his talented leadership would earn him the abilities and sympathies of the court of Constantius. But the emperor was suffering setbacks at the hands of the Persians, so these victories by his Caesar were seen as embarrassments. Constantius' jealousies were such that it is believed he was even forming plans to have Julian assassinated. But as the military predicament warranted, he needed urgent troops, and he needed Julian's best troops to fight the Persians. So he demanded Julian send some of his finest troops as reinforcements to the war against the Persians. But the soldiers in Gaul refused to obey. Their loyalties lay with Julian, and they saw this order as an act of jealousy and on behalf of the emperor. Instead, in February 360, they held Julian as emperor. Julian was said to be reluctant to accept the title. Perhaps he wanted to avoid a war with Constantius, or perhaps it was the reluctance of a man who never sought to rule anyways. In any case, he can't have possessed much loyalty to Constantius after, he executed his father and half-brother and exiled him in Cappadocia. Now, at first, Julian sought to negotiate with Constantius, but in vain. And so in AD 361, Julian set out for the east to meet his foe. Remarkably, he vanished into the German forest with an army of only about 3,000 men, only to reappear again on the lower Danube shortly after. This astounding effort was most likely made in order to reach the key Danubian legions as soon as possible to assure their allegiance, in that knowledge that all European units would surely follow their example. But this move was unnecessary because news arrived that Constantius had died. So Julian becomes the sole ruler of the Roman Empire in 361. So on his way to Constantinople, Julian officially declared himself a follower of the old pagan gods. With Constantine and his heirs having been Christian, and Julian having, while still under Constantius, officially still adhered to the Christian faith, this was an unexpected turn of events. And this is why history gives him the name Julian the Apostate, because it was his rejection of Christianity. Now in 361, he entered Constantinople as the sole emperor of the Roman world. Some of Constantius' supporters were executed, others were exiled. But Julian's accession was by no means such a bloody one as when the three sons of Constantine had begun their reign. Now over in Persia, the city of Nicaea was defended by 20,000 Romans. They delayed the Persians for 74 days and inflicted 30,000 dead upon the Persian invaders. The Persians raised siege mounds and iron-plated towers to command the walls, to which Romans responded with stone-throwing scorpions. A band of Persian archers seized a tower by means of a secret passage, but were dislodged by bolt-firing catapults. The city fell when a Roman counterattack collapsed, bridging the gap between the wall and a Persian mound. The Persians surged across. However, because of the losses, the Persians were unable to invade Syria. But this is a Roman loss in the hands of the Persians. So Julian, in 363, assembled an army in Syria and began to drive back the Persians' invaders. Reaching the Tigris, he forced a crossing in the face of strong Persian opposition. He was planning to take Ctesiphon, but it changed it to attack the Persian army. While marching upriver, his army fell under heavy Persian attack. Julian received a mortal wound and died. His legions proclaimed Jovian, one of their generals, emperor. Jovian accepted peace terms from Shapur II, which ceded all territory east of the Tigris to Shapur II. Jovian had to deal with barbarian invasions over at the Rhine and had success, but he did die early the following year. And the Romans get a loss here at the Tigris River. So that's two losses against the Persians. So Julian reigned from 361 to 363. His battle record in major battles was 2-1. Now, at the death of Jovian, the commanders of the army withdrawing from its Mesopotamian campaign, having reached Nicaea with the main force, held a council with some civic leaders to choose a new emperor. Together, they decided on Valentinian, who was still at Ankara at the time in 364. No sooner held emperor, Valentinian appointed his younger brother Valens as co-Augustus to rule over the east while he would govern the west. And we'll stop the video right here, and we'll start with the Valentinian Dynasty in the next video. So there's only like 2 videos left here, and we'll be done with the Western Roman Empire. And what I'm going to go to next is the North American Indians and try to lay out in chronological order the way in which they lost this land.